What if America's greatest Cold War victory secretly planted the seeds of its darkest tragedy? Think about it. One secret operation designed to push back the Soviet Union would end up giving rise to forces that turned against the very hands that fed them. This is the story of Operation Cyclone, the covert CIA mission that helped defeat a superpower, but also set in motion events that led to the rise of the Taliban al-Qaeda. But eventually, the attacks of September 11th. By the end of this video, you'll see how a war fought in the mountains of Afghanistan shaped the next 4 decades of global conflict. Stick around till the end because the payoff is clear. You'll understand how decisions made in secret rooms in Washington and Islamabad continue to echo in today's world. To understand Operation Cyclone, we need to go back to Afghanistan in the late 1970s. At first glance, it was a poor, mountainous country that didn't seem important on the global map. But its location made it a prize in the Cold War. Sitting between the Soviet Union, Iran, Pakistan, and close to the oil-rich Persian Gulf, Afghanistan became the ground where superpowers would clash. In 1978, a communist group called the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA, seized power in a coup. Their new government was brutal and unpopular. They pushed radical reforms that clashed with Afghan traditions, attacked religion, and relied heavily on Soviet advisors. Resistance spread quickly in the countryside, and the nation fell into chaos. By late 1979, the Soviet Union decided it couldn't afford to lose control of Afghanistan. In December, thousands of Soviet troops rolled across the border. They stormed the capital, Kabul, assassinated the Afghan leader Hafizullah Amin, and replaced him with a more loyal ally. The Soviets thought they could secure Afghanistan in a matter of months. Instead, they walked into their own Vietnam. The invasion shocked the world. For the United States, it was a nightmare scenario. The Soviets now sat dangerously close to the warm waters of the Persian Gulf, threatening vital oil supplies. Washington saw this not just as a regional conflict, but as a direct challenge in the Cold War. Something had to be done. That something came in the form of a covert operation. Instead of sending U.S. soldiers, the CIA would pour money, weapons, and training into Afghan rebels, the Mujahideen. But there was one condition. Everything had to be run through Pakistan's powerful intelligence service, the ISI. This decision would shape the future of Afghanistan and the world in ways no one could have predicted. The stage was set, a poor nation caught in the crossfire of global superpowers, an unpopular communist regime backed by Moscow, and a new American mission designed to bleed the Soviets dry. What started as a move on the Cold War chessboard would soon spiral far beyond anyone's control. In Washington, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan wasn't just alarming, it was personal. The United States had spent decades trying to contain Moscow's influence, and now the Red Army was marching toward the heart of the Middle East. The fear wasn't only about Afghanistan itself. What if the Soviets used it as a stepping stone toward Iran, Pakistan, or even the Persian Gulf? For American leaders, the answer was simple. They couldn't let that happen. President Jimmy Carter's administration responded first, authorizing secret aid to Afghan rebels in 1979. It was small at the beginning, money, supplies, and some basic support. But when Ronald Reagan entered the White House in 1981, the program exploded. Reagan wanted to roll back communism anywhere it appeared, and Afghanistan became the perfect battlefield for his strategy. This was the birth of Operation Cyclone, one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in CIA history. Billions of dollars began flowing. But the U.S. wasn't doing this alone. Saudi Arabia matched the American funds dollar for dollar. Other countries like China and Egypt also provided weapons. Yet none of this aid went directly to Afghan fighters. Instead, the CIA handed everything to Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, which decided who got what. This choice would have massive consequences. The ISI favored Islamist hardliners, men they believed would stay loyal to Pakistan's vision for Afghanistan. Moderates like Ahmad Shah Massoud, who had broad support among Afghans, often received less. But leaders like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, known for his ruthless tactics, were showered with resources. The U.S. looked the other way, focused only on the bigger prize, hurting the Soviets. And it wasn't just weapons. Fighters were trained in guerrilla tactics, taught how to plant bombs, ambush convoys, and survive in the harsh Afghan terrain. The message from Washington was clear: make the Soviet occupation as costly and painful as possible. On paper it looked like a smart plan. The U.S. could bleed its rival without risking American lives. But the seeds being planted were dangerous. America believed it was creating freedom fighters. In reality, it was empowering a movement that would later slip far beyond its control. The Afghan resistance fighters, known as the Mujahideen, were not a single army. They were a patchwork of factions, tribes, and leaders, each with its own goals, loyalties, and rivalries. What united them was a simple truth: they wanted the Soviets out of their land. Armed with religious conviction and fueled by anger, they launched a guerrilla war against one of the most powerful militaries in the world. Life in the mountains shaped their style of fighting. They knew the valleys, caves, and passes better than any invader ever could. They struck Soviet convoys, ambushed patrols, and then melted back into the rugged terrain. For the Mujahideen, survival was victory. Every Soviet casualty proved that even a superpower could bleed. But here's where things got complicated. With CIA money flowing through Pakistan, not every fighter was treated equally. Pakistan's ISI poured resources into Islamist hardliners, especially Ghabuddin Hekmatyar, a brutal warlord despised even by many Afghans. Meanwhile, more moderate leaders like Ahmad Shah Massoud, who dreamed of a broader Afghan unity, often received scraps. The choices made by the ISI, and tolerated by Washington, tilted the balance of the resistance in favor of extremists. As the war dragged on, foreign fighters began to arrive. Volunteers from across the Muslim world, inspired by the call to jihad, traveled to Afghanistan. Among them was a wealthy young man from Saudi Arabia, Osama bin Laden. At first, he wasn't a military mastermind. He was a fundraiser using his money to build camps, tunnels, and networks of support. But his presence symbolized something bigger: the birth of an international movement of jihadists who saw Afghanistan as just the beginning. To the United States, the Mujahideen were freedom fighters. They were the heroes standing up to communism. Hollywood movies, news reports, and even speeches by President Reagan painted them as noble warriors. And for a time it looked like the narrative fit. The Soviets were struggling, and the rebels were growing bolder. But beneath the surface, a dangerous transformation was happening. A fractured resistance was becoming a breeding ground for future extremists. And the U.S., focused only on the Cold War, didn't see the storm that was slowly forming. By the mid-1980s, the war in Afghanistan had reached a stalemate. The Soviets controlled the cities and main roads. But the countryside remained a battlefield. The Mujahideen were fierce. But Soviet helicopters and fighter jets gave Moscow the edge. From the skies they could bomb villages, hunt down rebels, and disrupt supply lines. For many Afghans, the sound of rotor blades meant terror. If the Soviets kept control of the air, the resistance might eventually break. Then came the game changer: the American-made FIM-92 Stinger missile. It was small, portable, and deadly. A single fighter could carry it on his shoulder, aim at a helicopter, and fire. Suddenly, the skies that once belonged to the Soviets turned into a death trap. Within months of their arrival in 1986, Soviet aircraft were being shot down in numbers that Moscow could not ignore. The balance of power shifted almost overnight. For the Mujahideen, the psychological impact was as great as the military one. Fighters who once hid in fear when helicopters appeared now stood their ground. Villagers, who had once felt helpless, saw the Soviets burning in the wreckage of their own machines. The narrative of invincibility surrounding the Red Army was shattered. The Stingers became a symbol of American ingenuity and Afghan resilience. To Washington, this was proof that Operation Cyclone was working. Billions of dollars had been poured into the conflict. And now the results were visible. In Congress and on TV, U.S. officials hailed the Mujahideen as heroes standing for freedom. President Reagan even met Afghan fighters at the White House, praising them as the moral equivalent of America's founding fathers. But this turning point was about more than weapons. It marked the moment when the Soviet leadership realized the war could not be won. The cost in lives, money, and reputation was too high. Afghanistan, meant to be a quick intervention, was dragging the Soviet Union into its own version of Vietnam. The tide had turned. and the countdown to Moscow's retreat had begun. But victory for the Mujahideen did not mean peace for Afghanistan. The real chaos was still to come. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was exhausted. What was supposed to be a short intervention had turned into a bloody, endless war. Nearly 10 years of fighting had drained Moscow's economy, killed thousands of its soldiers, and eroded its image as a superpower. At home, Soviet mothers were burying their sons. Abroad, the world was watching the Red Army stumble against guerrilla fighters armed with Western support. In 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev, the new Soviet leader, called Afghanistan a bleeding wound. He wanted reform inside the Soviet Union and needed to end costly foreign entanglements. The decision was made: it was time to leave. In 1988, the Geneva Accords were signed, laying out the path for withdrawal. Over the next year, Soviet troops began marching out through the Salong Pass, heading back across the border. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldier officially left Afghanistan. For the Mujahideen, it was a moment of triumph. They had done what no one thought possible: defeated a superpower. For Washington, it was a Cold War victory worth celebrating. But the story didn't end there. Afghanistan was in ruins. Millions of Afghans had fled as refugees. Villages were destroyed, farmland was littered with landmines, and the economy was shattered. Worse, the resistance fighters were no longer united. With their common enemy gone, the Mujahideen factions turned their guns on each other. The U.S., having achieved its goal of bleeding the Soviets, began to lose interest. Aid and attention slowed. Afghanistan, once a centerpiece of Cold War strategy, was abandoned to chaos. Out of this chaos, new powers began to rise. The Taliban would emerge in the 1990s, promising order through strict rule. And within the safe havens of Afghanistan, a new kind of threat was taking shape: al-Qaeda. The Soviet retreat was the end of one war. But it was also the opening chapter of another. Afghanistan was free of Soviet tanks. But the seeds of future conflict had already been sown. When the last Soviet tank rolled out of Afghanistan in 1989, the world cheered. But for Afghans, the nightmare was only beginning. The common enemy was gone. And with it, the fragile unity of the Mujahideen collapsed. Instead of peace, Afghanistan slipped into a brutal civil war. Warlords who had once fought side by side now fought each other for power. Kabul, the capital, became a battlefield. Rockets rained down daily, and neighborhoods were torn apart by shelling. Civilians, who had already endured a decade of Soviet occupation, now faced violence from their own countrymen. The promise of freedom was replaced with lawlessness, corruption, and despair. In this chaos, Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, looked for a new force to stabilize Afghanistan, one that would serve its interests and keep India at bay. Their answer was a movement born in the religious schools, or madrasas, along the Afghan-Pakistani border. These students, known as the Taliban, promised to end corruption and bring order through strict Islamic law. By 1994, they began their rise, quickly winning territory. Many war-weary Afghans, desperate for stability, welcomed them. Within just 2 years, the Taliban captured Kabul. They hanged the former communist leader Najibullah and declared the creation of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. For the first time since the Soviet invasion, the country had a central authority, but it came with a price. Under Taliban rule, freedoms vanished. Women were forced out of schools and workplaces. Music, movies, and even simple joys of life were banned. Justice was swift, often carried out in public squares. Yet the Taliban offered something the warlords couldn't: control. Roads were safer, trade slowly resumed. And for many Afghans that was enough. But hidden within this new order was a dangerous alliance. The Taliban gave sanctuary to foreign fighters who had once come to battle the Soviets. Among them was Osama bin Laden, who was building a network that would soon turn its sights on the West. Afghanistan had escaped one war, but it was now the breeding ground for the next. The power vacuum left after the Soviet retreat had been filled, but with forces that would drag the world into a new era of conflict. In the 1980s, the United States proudly called the Afghan fighters freedom fighters. President Reagan even welcomed them into the White House as heroes. But by the 1990s, that image began to crumble. The same networks that America and its allies had helped build during Operation Cyclone were now shifting their focus. Their new target wasn't Moscow, it was Washington. Osama bin Laden, once just a wealthy Saudi supporting the Afghan jihad, had grown into something far more dangerous. With his group al-Qaeda, he believed the next great battle was against the far enemy, the United States. To him and his followers, America wasn't a liberator. It was an occupier of Muslim lands, especially after U.S. troops were stationed in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War of 1991. This became the rallying cry that transformed anger into global jihad. Throughout the 1990s, al-Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan deepened under the Taliban's protection. Training camps were built. Recruits from across the Muslim world were trained in explosives, ambush tactics, and covert operations. What had started as a war against Soviet tanks was now becoming a war against embassies, ships, and civilians. The warning signs came quickly. In 1993, al-Qaeda-linked militants attacked the World Trade Center in New York. In 1998, they bombed U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing hundreds. In 2000, the USS Cole, a U.S. Navy destroyer, was bombed in Yemen, leaving 17 sailors dead. Each strike showed growing ambition, sophistication, and boldness. But Washington underestimated the scale of the threat. Some officials saw al-Qaeda as a regional nuisance, not a global menace. Meanwhile, Osama bin Laden was plotting something far more devastating. Under the Taliban's watchful eye, he prepared for an attack that would change the world forever. The transformation was complete. Yesterday's freedom fighters had become today's sworn enemies. What began as a Cold War strategy was now spiraling into a global conflict that America never intended to start. The stage was set for the morning of September 11, 2001, a day when the blowback from Operation Cyclone would hit home in the most violent way possible. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the consequences of Operation Cyclone came crashing down. 4 passenger planes were hijacked by al-Qaeda operatives. 2 slammed into the Twin Towers of New York's World Trade Center. A third struck the Pentagon. The 4th, United Airlines Flight 93, was brought down by brave passengers before it could hit its target in Washington, D.C. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in a single morning, the deadliest terrorist attack in history. For Americans, the shock was overwhelming. But for those who understood the history, it was a chilling reminder of how yesterday's allies had turned into today's enemies. The fighters once armed and trained to bleed the Soviet Union were now striking at the heart of the United States. Washington's response was swift. Within weeks, U.S. forces invaded Afghanistan. The mission was clear: destroy al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime that sheltered them. The war began with overwhelming firepower. Taliban fighters fled cities, al-Qaeda camps were bombed. And Osama bin Laden himself escaped into the mountains of Tora Bora. It seemed like a quick victory. But Afghanistan would not be conquered so easily. What began as a counterterrorism operation soon stretched into the longest war in American history. Year after year, U.S. troops remained, battling an insurgency that refused to die. Trillions of dollars were spent. Thousands of lives were lost. The war dragged on through multiple presidents with no clear end in sight. Finally, after 2 decades, America followed in the footsteps of the Soviet Union. In August 2021, U.S. forces withdrew from Afghanistan. The Taliban, once ousted, swept back into power almost overnight. Kabul fell. And the cycle seemed complete. The story had come full circle. A covert operation designed to weaken one superpower had helped trap another in the same unforgiving mountains. The victory of Operation Cyclone had turned into a long, grinding tragedy. Operation Cyclone was meant to be a triumph. It was designed as a secret plan to bleed the Soviet Union. And on that front, it worked. The Red Army limped home in defeat. And not long after, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. Washington celebrated it as one of the greatest victories of the Cold War. But history rarely follows a straight line. The same fighters America once called freedom fighters grew into movements that tore Afghanistan apart and later turned their fury on the United States. What seemed like a clever strategy in the 1980s created a chain of events that led to civil war, the rise of the Taliban, the birth of al-Qaeda, and the attacks of 9/11. A war fought in the shadows came back into the open, reshaping the 21st century. In many ways, Operation Cyclone is the perfect example of unintended consequences. A short-term success became a long-term disaster. A move on the Cold War chessboard created a legacy of instability that still haunts global politics today. For Afghanistan, it meant decades of suffering, foreign occupation, an endless war. For America, it meant trillions spent, countless lives lost. And the sobering realization that sometimes yesterday's victories can become tomorrow's nightmares. So, what can we learn from this? Maybe that history isn't just about winning or losing, it's about the costs we leave behind. Every decision made in secret rooms, every weapon shipped across borders, every alliance built for convenience has consequences that ripple far beyond the moment. Operation Cyclone began as a covert mission to topple a rival. It ended as a cautionary tale for the entire world.